Today, we're going to be looking at the spectrum of effort, why it appears that some people simply work harder than others. We're going to be looking at this question through primarily a neuroscientific approach and answering the questions such as, is it biological? Is there something that can be changed? Right? Are there different levels of work rate based on who the person is and what factors contribute to a high work rate versus a low work rate? Now, before we dive into the neuroscience, I'd like to go over four main environmental factors that contribute to work rate. The first one is the trust of long term rewards. What do I mean by that? Parents that promise their children rewards in the future and follow through on those promises help the child build a trust in the idea of delayed gratification and waiting for a payoff, which they're more likely to enact in their life. And the opposite is true. Parents who do not follow through on long term promises for their child will most likely lead their child to not waiting for payoff and get them into the habit of taking rewards as soon as they come. A big theme of this topic is understanding that people who have high work rates show a lot more openness to the idea of delayed gratification than people who do not. The second environmental factor that I'd like to touch on is the neighborhood effect and social mirroring. It's a very well known quote, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And this perfectly ties into this. If you hang around with people who generate wealth, you will likely start to generate wealth. If you hang around people who do not make money, you will probably not make money. And the same is true with work rate. If you surround yourself with people who work extremely hard and are very industrious and capable people, you will become one of those people. And the opposite is true as well. So that's very important, manipulating an environment to surround yourself with people who have a high work rate. The third environmental factor is a high cortisol environment. Environments or households with a lot of chaos and stress move control from the prefrontal cortex to habit circuits, which shorten the planning horizon. Right? People in these environments tend to think more short term rather than long term. The last and arguably most important environmental factor is the effort threshold. Every task carries a cost of energy. An action only occurs when the value gained from the task is perceived to be greater than the effort put in. Now, why is this so important and applicable today? Well, if the brain gets used to putting in high amounts of energy to extract dopamine from completing a task, then the effort threshold will raise and it will get used to putting in the effort and it won't feel as difficult. But if the brain gets used to gaining dopamine from a task without putting in any effort, like short form content and scrolling on social media, the effort threshold will plummet and the brain will get used to not having to put in any effort whatsoever to receive the dopamine. And so then when you try to switch and do a task that takes effort and actual exertion to complete, the brain is much more hesitant to get in because it knows it can just get dopamine from scrolling the easy way. So those are the main environmental factors that influence work rate. Now, diving into the neuroscience before we get into the actual processes, I'd like to identify four key components, the hardware, if you will. The first is the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. This is the origin of the mesolimbic dopamine projection. All right, so this is the source of the dopamine itself. The second part is very well known, the prefrontal cortex. This holds the goal in mind, sustains the plan for long term, and exerts a sort of top down control over behavior. The third region is the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, this monitors the conflict and cost of a task and allocates how much effort a task is worth. You may have heard of the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, which is in this region, and that's a relatively new breakthrough in neuroscience. And that region, the AMCC, is actually shown to physically expand when a task is undertaken that you did not want to do and the task is completed. So that's very interesting and applicable to this topic. The fourth region is the anterior insula. This is where you feel that aversiveness to exert a lot of energy. Now, the question arises, is there any physical brain difference that we can see between people who work hard and people who do not? And the answer to that is actually yes. There was a groundbreaking Vanderbilt University study that came out that showed that hard workers and slackers handle dopamine differently. So remember, dopamine comes from the VTA, and in high effort individuals, dopamine is active in the ventral striatum and the prefrontal cortex. And what that is essentially doing is, in their mind, magnifying the perceived reward of a task and minimizing the perceived effort of a task. So these people are primarily focused on the reward of a task. Whereas low effort individuals secrete dopamine into the anterior insula. And remember, that's the region that's in charge of aversion, of putting in any effort or exertion into a task. So this does the opposite. This magnifies the perceived effort of a task and minimizes the perceived reward. So we can confidently say now that a big difference between high effort individuals and low effort individuals is that high effort individuals focus on the reward of a task. Low effort individuals focus on the effort of a task. Now, another process that plays into this is cost benefit integration. There was a study from Emory University that used fMRI scans to map how the brain calculates if a task is worth pursuing, and it makes the most sense to divide this process up into three set categories. All right, so undertaking any one task goes through these three phases. The first is anticipating the work, and this is before any action is undertaken. The second is executing the actual physical effort. And the third is receiving the reward, or the end of the task. And during this process, there are two opposing signals that run at once. There is an activation signal that rises as effort demand increases, and a discounting signal that lowers the value of any reward that costs more to obtain. And their balance is actually what the switch or ventral striatum is actually deciding. Now, we know that decision making or computation is subconscious. How do we know that? Because it is ingrained into every living being. Right? A lion does not have the same capability for abstract thought or reasoning that we do. But if it spots a gazelle 150 yards away, it will make the computation of, is the reward of this gazelle worth the effort that I'm going to put into chasing it down and getting it? And if it is, then it will pursue the gazelle, and if it's not, then it will not. And it's very binary for them because the brain is wired to put in the least amount of effort possible to survive. So this computation is, again, run in every animal in the animal kingdom. And if we look over to the right here, there is an equation that represents motivation. Any field of study is considered immature until it has significant or clear units of measurements. And where neuroscience gets fuzzy is when we start to go into the concept of conscious or subconscious processes, because there are no real units of measurement, so it's considered an immature field. What this equation is doing is expressing quantitatively what the idea of motivation is, right, using mathematical terms. So let's break it down. Motivation equals expectancy times value over 1 plus impulsiveness times delay. What does that mean? Well, expectancy is, will the effort actually work, right? And the value is, how much is the outcome worth? These are both perceived. Impulsiveness, obviously, how easily is attention pulled away? So higher impulsiveness for a task, lower motivation for a task, and the same with delay, right? Higher delay, higher time period before the payoff of the task arrives, a lower motivation to undertake said task. It's a very intuitive equation, and it makes a lot of sense when you plug in the values and think of it that way. So, what can we conclude from all of this? Well, two things. Effort is computed in the brain, and it is malleable, it is changeable. You can change your effort. No one is born with the ability to work harder than someone else. So the environment that you're surrounding yourself in sets the terms. Like we talked about, those four main environmental factors. And the circuitry of the brain runs the arithmetic or the computation constantly for every single task throughout the day. It's just a computation over and over and over. And if you don't take anything else from this presentation, I want you to take this one thing. Where dopamine lands decides the output. I'll say it again. Where dopamine lands decides the output. There's no magical serum in a hard worker's brain that a slacker doesn't have. The amount of dopamine doesn't matter. It is simply where the dopamine is routed to. And you may be wondering, you can't physically go in and with your hands switch where the dopamine is in your brain. But can you take action or start to form habits that naturally switch the dopamine from one region of the brain to the other? In this case, the anterior insula to the prefrontal cortex. And the answer to that is absolutely yes. Remember, the fourth environmental factor that we talked about is the effort threshold. That bar can be raised and lowered constantly. Someone who extracts dopamine from doing hard things, the tasks will, or the perceived effort will feel less. But if they get addicted to getting dopamine from easy tasks such as scrolling and short form content, their effort threshold will plummet and go into the basement. And they will, if they try to pick up those hard tasks again, they will find it very difficult. Well, if that's true, then it must be true that someone who is addicted to this short form content and scrolling and extracting dopamine from tasks that take no effort, if they cut that out and start to get dopamine only from tasks that require exertion, physical or mental, that the effort threshold will raise and they will start to get used to it. So if there's someone watching who feels that they can put in more effort than they have been putting in or wants to be a harder worker, the piece of actionable advice I can give you is to cut out the easy dopamine extracting tasks. And what do I mean by that? Mainly cutting out short form content and scrolling. Because if you sit down and you try to start a project, your brain will be much more likely to look at the phone and pick up your phone because you're 3 clicks away from getting the same dopamine that you would if you completed the task. So it's very important to start to train your brain to extract dopamine from tasks that take actual effort. The brain is trained for survival and efficiency, which is not always the best thing for us. If the brain learns that it can get dopamine with 3 clicks of a button instead of putting forth any sort of effort, then it will 100%, 10 times out of 10, desire to do that instead. So it is very important to learn to adjust where you are deriving dopamine if you want to work harder. And if you start deriving dopamine from tasks that take exertion and are difficult, you will get used to that. It will feel uncomfortable at first, but that is just the brain adjusting. And once the brain adjusts, it will feel a lot better and the effort will feel easier, and it is a snowball effect from there. That's all I have today. I hope you enjoyed this video and hope you have a good rest of your day.